Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, we cover free speech and the state of free speech on a pretty regular basis on this program. And I'm delighted that today my guest is someone who is certainly a friend of the channel. Claire Fox, Baroness Fox. Thank you very much for joining us, Claire. I want to start by asking you what happened last week. We saw it in the newspapers, but I'd like for our audience, if you could, to explain that you were, what would you say, deplatformed, cancelled, what would you call it?
Well, I think that I was disinvited by the society that invited me, right, which they are within their rights to do. I mean, you know, you can change your mind. But of course, what really happened behind the scenes was that a debating society at the Royal Holloway University of London were very enthusiastic about me going along and giving a talk on the importance of debate.
Yeah.
Not exactly a controversial subject, you'd think. And in order to pass muster with the student union, they'd spent months filling in forms, and they were checking, the student union had to check that I wasn't a threat to student society. Anyway, you know, even though I find it demeaning that this was going on behind the scenes, I somehow passed. All was good in the world.
Right.
But as soon as the society advertised that I was speaking, some other societies objected, lobbied the student union then decided that I was a hate criminal of some sort, and that I therefore would threaten the safety of the students. And they then went about bullying and harassing and strong-arming the debating society, and say you can't have her on campus, it'll lead to security problems, there'll be people feeling unsafe, people will actually, you know, there'll be chaos and all the rest of it. And a week before, the committee of the debating society panicked and said, look, we can't have you. And that, in a way, is a tale of our time, and I would have left it there had I not been then approached by a number of members of the debating society who said they were so outraged by what had happened, could I help them fight it and get some publicity for it? And so we wrote to the student union, or the free speech union, you know, sent properly lawyered letters to the student union and to the college authorities, to the vice chancellor, and shockingly, the letters, there was no reply from the student union, and the principal of the college wrote an incredibly complacent and dismissive letter saying there's nothing to see here. The student society, the debating society, obviously didn't want Baroness Fox to speak. We've checked with the student union, they didn't do anything, nothing to see here. Yes, we know what our legal obligations are, go away, effectively. And this seemed to me to be the worst kind of leadership in a university, that you wouldn't even investigate, go and talk to the students involved. So that's why it became a big news story.
But what was their reason?
Oh yes, well, of course, I've, you know, infamously now, the evidence of my great hate-mongering was a tweet that I retweeted of Ricky Gervais telling a gender-critical joke.
Oh, like the quite famous one now.
The famous clip,
yes,
about the old-fashioned women with wombs versus the new kind of women. You know, we won't repeat it.
No, but with beards
and other things. And actually, he was using what is now actually you are meant to accept by those who support gender ideology. He wasn't saying anything disrespectful. He was drawing our attention to the ludicrous nature of what's happened when it comes to discussions around biological sex and trans issues. It was very funny, shared by millions of people up until then, and I'd retweeted it at the time with a "he's got it in 1 minute" type of thing. I was actually a bit offended that the only thing they could find against me was the fact that I'd retweeted Ricky Gervais. I kept thinking, goodness me, I make all these very provocative speeches in the House of Lords or through the Academy of Ideas or what have you, and this is it. But actually, on a more serious note, it doesn't matter that I was cancelled, because goodness knows I talk at lots of places and I've got too many talks on.
Right.
Get a night off. What's wrong with that? And it's not as though I don't have platforms. I've got plenty of places that I can be heard. I'm here. I'm in the House of Lords every day. I've got, you know, I can write newspaper. You know, I wasn't complaining about that. What was really cancelled at Royal Holloway was the students' right to invite who they want.
Yeah.
hear who they want and even argue with who they want, because a lot of the students who would have gone to that talk and discussion would have challenged me, I assume, on a range of topics, and they were denied the opportunity to do that. That was what the student union forced a cancellation of, and what the college management went along with.
Yeah, but this is in some ways the worrying thing. You almost expect it from the student union in an odd way, but it's the authorities of the university. They are so craven, are they not?
Completely. And I've found over years now, when I've been discussing the issue of cancel culture on campus, it's very tempting to see it only or always as the fault of snowflake students. And I mean, I use that phrase, the snowflake generation. It does capture something. But I suddenly realised that maybe they were being scapegoated somewhat, because, you know, so students say, I'm so thin-skinned that I can't hear something uncomfortable. I don't want that to be in my curriculum because it's offensive, etc., etc. What you'd anticipate would be that the academics on campus, and particularly the academic leadership of a university, the academic leadership of a university would challenge them and say, look, the whole point of coming to this university is that you will be confronted with ideas that you're not familiar with, you might find a bit distressing sometimes. Certainly will challenge your prior prejudices or views, because actually that's why you go to university. I mean, if you didn't change your views at all while you were at university, what is the point in going?
Are you surprised by the fact that they don't do that? I mean, when were you at university?
Very long time ago, in the 80s.
Same here, but late 70s, early 80s. It was extremely political, but I don't recall any particular debate about free speech. It was just the level of extremity, you know, in the politics. But
there was while I was at university, actually, interestingly, there was a very big no platform row that happened at Warwick University at the early 80s that I actually was involved in. But this was an attempt by the university or the student union rather, to bring in a no platform motion that said that they wanted to ban extremists such as the National Front, and then they captured up in that anti-abortionists. So at Warwick University at the time, there was a very large anti-abortion group. But it's also the case that we were living in a society in the early 80s in Coventry, because I was at Warwick University, where the National Front would literally go around in gangs of 20, 25 and hang around, and they'd often come on campus. Now, I was arguing for free speech, no ifs, no buts, even then. But at least then, the no platforming was intended to be against what they considered to be extreme. Now what's happened is a much more insidious broadening out of who is described as extreme, what views are captured by that. And it's not formal no platform policies that are used. It's often safeguarding, safe spaces. So the excuse for me going on campus or being prevented from going on campus was that I represented a threat to the safety of the students, because we've now conflated physical violence
and speech
with words.
Yeah.
And of course, once you do that, and we've seen this recently, once you say that somebody's views are the equivalent of punching someone in the face, then you're effectively saying that if you don't like those words, you're given a green light to punch them back. If we can't tell the difference between words and physical, violent acts, then you can see that mayhem ensues. And so when you say, was I surprised? No, I wasn't surprised. I was, however, I was particularly incensed by the tone of the principal's letter, which I felt didn't take the issue seriously. And I think that in today's climate, and there is a pushback by all sorts of people, that at least if you're an academic leader, you've got to now take note of the fact that there's this censorious climate emerging, yes, from the bottom, from students, particularly from student activists and student unions, and particularly around the issues of gender. I mean, that's a particularly harsh one, but it could be anything. We know that. It could be on critical race theory. It could be as limited as somebody saying something offensive in a seminar. But you'd think that therefore academic leadership would at least make an effort to pretend that they cared about academic freedom. But this letter, it seemed to me, did the opposite of that.
You say there that there's kind of groundswell, particularly amongst activists, of intolerance. Are you worried, in the way that I am, when you see these surveys that show that young people, and I presume that includes students, actually quite brazenly don't particularly rate free speech? Something like 40-50% think that giving offence is more important, or not giving offence is more important than free speech. The whole concept of free speech as a fundamental principle seems not really to worry them.
I think that this is the crisis that our generation have to take responsibility for, because I think what has happened is that free speech has just become a slogan. It's an emptied and hollowed out slogan. You can no longer in America say, what about the First Amendment? In the UK, you can't say free speech, J.S. Mill, and hope that will win you an argument.
Yeah.
In other words, we haven't found ways of reanimating why free speech is important for new generations. I mean, this is surely why the New Culture Forum, and I hope the Academy of Ideas, matter today, because we're trying to bring some new life to those important foundational values, which I feel have been neglected. So what happens is that you can understand that, you're 18, 19, it's not imbued in you that free speech is important. Somebody has to argue with you about why it's a value. Society has to hold that up as a shining light and have explained to you the importance of it. But the adults in the room have not done that. And very often, free speech is, increasingly, it's being used to say to an 18, 19-year-old, the only reason those people want free speech is so they can spout their bigotry.
Yeah.
Now, if you're 18 or 19, you don't want to be a bigot, do you? I mean, you go to university, you think you're a free thinker, and you say, do you want to be a bigot on that side, or would you like to be a tolerant, kind, inclusive person? I mean, anyone who chose to be a bigot in those circumstances, you'd be a bit worried about. So, in an atmosphere where we've basically devalued free speech as a society, it's no longer given the prominence that it should in political discourse, in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords. People will constantly emphasise equality, diversity, inclusion. You'll hear it so often. The terms net zero never off the lips of a Lord in the House of Lords where I am. All of these things are bigged up, as it were. Free speech, rarely. And when I speak, often people say, oh, she's on her hobby horse, her free speech hobby horse, said with a sneer. And then a recent development, part of the narrative that you're also, I know that you've covered this and it's important to state, is if you insist on talking about free speech issues, you're said to be trying to stir up the culture war, and that this is some American-funded plot to divide society, rather than actually those of us who respond to what others are doing, which is actually politicizing culture and saying that, for example, whether it's a statue, a novel, a film, has to be censored, given a trigger warning, is somehow evil because it doesn't reflect today's mores, all of those issues that we're familiar with. We didn't raise that, other people did. I wouldn't have made a fuss at Royal Holloway. I wouldn't have talked, by the way, about trans. I wasn't intending to. I was going to go and talk about the importance of debate. But because then it was closed down, that's what created a kind of culture wars atmosphere where I said, okay, I'm going to fight this now.
Interesting, you say, those things other things are never off the lips of lords and MPs, net zero, whatever. One thing you never hear anymore people say is, well, it's a free country. You used to hear that all the time.
Yes.
When I was going, never hear it now. And it's just one of those strange little, byproducts, I think. We've had an example recently in New Zealand with Posey Parker, of what you might call extreme bullying when it comes to free speech. Very much in line with what you're just saying, what struck me is that there hasn't been a single comment from a senior politician, unless you can correct me there. I don't think there has. That is surely the kind of thing which actually is going to intimidate people into not being free with their speech.
Exactly right. I mean, I think one Conservative MP, and I can't, forgive me, remember his name, but to his credit, when asked by Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk TV, did side with Posey Parker. But I can tell you now, in different circumstances, there'd be urgent questions, demands for debates in the House and so on and so forth. If this was a different issue and it involved a UK citizen being treated like this. And how interesting is it that one of the other popular causes in Parliament, but outside amongst activists, is violence against women and girls. So everybody wants to talk about violence against women and girls. It's a bit of an amorphous term. You know, as a woman, I'm, good. Society's caught up and says violence against women is not a good thing. Thank goodness for that, eh? But isn't it fascinating that here we had a very high profile example of a woman from the UK who was mobbed in a violent attack in New Zealand, evidence on camera, so we all know about it, hit the headlines of the media around the world in many instances, and suddenly all of those supporters of violence against women and girls go quiet. They don't mention that as an example. So apparently it's okay to use violence against Posey Parker because she's the wrong kind of woman with the wrong kind of politics. And another way that this has become legitimised, and we're seeing this more and more, is that you describe your opponents as Nazis and fascists, and that somehow is then used to victim blame, to justify the violence. Now, of course, it is true. If you told me in all seriousness that some Nazis were gathering, and I took you literally to mean Nazis, and the kind of exceptional, vicious violence. I mean, it's not even a way to describe the Holocaust, but, if you can associate it with that, well, of course, I would I would be unlikely to go, I'll have a cup of tea with Hitler in a chat. You join the resistance, as people did. That's the way you think of it, as something that needs to be dealt with. Now, if you have the promiscuous use of that label by people in senior positions in society, we've had the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, implying that opposition to his expansion of the low emission zone is a far-right, conspiratorial, Nazi-aligned moment. I mean, it's just thrown about all the time. If you say that to people, surely what you're doing is saying these people are not legitimate to debate with. And what's more is, it's perfectly reasonable to target them with absolute hostility. And indeed, if you use violence, not that it's incited, but if you use violence, we'll understand it because after all, you're anti-Nazi, anti-fash, the anti-Fa movement. And this is a very dangerous development, because I've seen people getting whipped up to think, and they genuinely believe that Posey Parker is some kind of a fascist and so they then think, well, anything goes, This is a very, very serious state of affairs. But you're right that the biggest problem is not those demonstrators, but the fact that people in leadership positions in the media, in politics, in, the bien-pensant of this country, of any country, are not absolutely speaking out against it. And showing, therefore, those young 18, 19-year-olds are a bit confused that there are two sides to this story, that they should at least consider that maybe the importance of free speech is something to consider, rather than simply going, close them down, drive them out, drive them off the stage.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about the bien-pensant and the lawmakers. You're now right in the middle of them, aren't you, in the House of Lords. There is this bill going through, Claire, that you've, I think, written about too, or spoken about, which is the Higher Education Freedom of Speech bill. Can you tell us what's happening with that? Because it's really quite important. It rather confirms what we've been talking about, kind of craven approach. From what I can gather, there were certain provisions in it which came to the Lords, which were then thrown out. Can you explain what?
Yes, this is a very important bill. I think it's worth saying that I had to really be persuaded to support this bill, because I was worried that we use legislation too frequently to deal with social and cultural problems, and was this another example of a law that was going to tackle cancel culture on campus, and maybe it was evasive and avoiding tackling the really deep-rooted problems we've been talking about. But I was persuaded. I listened to people like Kathleen Stock and colleagues, and I thought, actually, maybe we do need to up the ante when it comes to legislation. So I threw my lot in with the Conservative government, which is something I have to think about at least. It's not something I do spontaneously or naturally, and decided I'd support their new bill. And it was fascinating as it trundled through the Lords the first time round, because it became apparent initially that the majority of people on the opposition benches were denying that there was a problem of cancel culture on campus. They were just saying, was ever thus, we all went on demos, this is completely not necessary. That actually shifted a little, but I then realised that when people were standing up and saying there is no problem on campus, or you're exaggerating this problem on campus, you should spend more time at universities as I do. And I was kind of looking at these people. I don't know everybody in the Lords, you know, on either side, and in all of the parties. And some of these people I'd never met or seen before. And what I discovered was that the Lords is full of a particular type of a person familiar with universities. That is, they're all vice chancellors. So then I realised, so when you say you ought to go to universities, well, what you're saying from your ivory tower, quite literally, is we haven't got a problem like that on our campus that I run. You know, I deny to say I don't know what you're talking about. These are exaggerated, confected culture wars issues, and so on and so forth. So they presented quite a formidable lobbying group, and there were backbench Tories involved in this as well. I don't want to make out it was just Labour or Lib Dem. It was crossbench, all sides of the House, effectively gathered together to defang this academic freedom, free speech bill. So they wanted to remove the section of it which would allow easy access to being able to sue.
On the part of academics who want to sue?
Academics or students who could simply use the tort part of the bill to say, if you deny me academic freedom, I can go to the law courts if necessary.
Or lose the grant, maybe?
There was a wide range of ways that you could deploy that. So it meant that the enhanced free speech academic freedom duties in the bill, which for the first time, by the way, would put those duties onto student unions as well as universities. And the reason we needed these enhanced duties is because the law already says that all universities have an obligation to free speech. So it's an attempt to, you know, make it a higher threshold. But that really wouldn't count for much unless you had some deterrent angle. So the first thing that that we realised was a problem was when the government, and this was the government, about their own bill, compromised on the tort and basically accepted getting rid of it. And the Vice-Chancellor's lobby in the Lords were so excited that they pushed any attempt at tort out. So it went back to the Commons, and then understandably the government were so annoyed that their compromise had kind of ended up with them being defeated that they then went back to their original harder position on tort. This is too technical.
And this takes no, it's quite important.
It's quite important.
This takes months. You're talking about
months. So so we've all been waiting for it to come back. So this is, you know, what happens in legislation making. Eventually we get a date for this Commons return of the bill with the new enhanced tort in it. And I was all ready to speak. And because of what had happened at Royal Holloway, I was going to, for once, really enthusiastically welcome that the government had got its backbone back and say to them, these students at Royal Holloway have been really abandoned by everyone, we'll be grateful. And I'd got there, you know, I talked to them about this, that they could use this important legislation. 20 minutes before that debate was going to occur, the government ministers in the House of Lords issued a statement saying that they'd accepted a compromise amendment from Lord Willits, David Willits, who is one of the people who did not want tort in the bill. And so we were stabbed in the back by government ministers.
Right.
20 minutes before, completely. So my speech took a rather different tone. Let's put it that way. And a lot of us who were the free speech, peers, I suppose, were so shocked. And also because we weren't expecting that to occur, there wasn't lots of people in because it was going to be a fairly straightforward, effectively the Lords would end up accepting what the Commons had said because ultimately the Commons have sway. But this was Lords ministers.
Yeah.
So on behalf of the government, I mean, who knows whether the Department of Education are happy with those Lords ministers, but they did that, and they did it right at the last minute. And the explanation by Lord Howe, Earl Howe, Freddie Howe, was that he'd spent a lot of time listening to his fellows in the Lords, and he'd heard their concerns and so on. And of course, you realise that who he'd been listening to and talking to in the Lords were all these vice-chancellors and college principals. I mean, talk about, captured institutions. He hadn't spoken to any of us who were on the more free speech side, and he certainly hadn't spoken to any academics who have demanded this legislation, or any of the students who were victims of cancel culture, as I've described. So as a real betrayal, we're now at the stage where it's gone back to the Commons, and I think that the embarrassing difficulty for the Department of Education is, do they stick with the ministers in the Lords, or do they try and have some kind of compromise come back to us, or do they let this bill through? And by the way, with this compromise amendment put forward by David Willetts, which is now part of the bill, to be honest with you, this bill could mean nothing. It could be yet another box-ticking exercise. And indeed, the principal at Royal Holloway said, we are very aware of the new legislation in place. We are going through it carefully with the student union to see what our obligations are. And you could see them just with their red pen ticking, it's a box ticking exercise. That's very different to, oh my goodness, we better change, because if we don't, the compromise, just to explain, would mean that eventually you could go to court, but only after you had gone through every other possible measure internally in the college. Now think about that for those students in Royal Holloway. That means that they would have had to go to the people who actually had caused the problem in the first place.
It's just not going to happen, is it?
It's not going to happen. It's too many hoops to jump through. But what's more is you're effectively going to the university and saying, please will you help us sort this out? And they're saying there's nothing to see here and we're not going to do anything because they don't want to fuss. So actually you're throwing those students under the bus. Can you imagine an academic in a university who feels that they're not getting a grant because of their gender critical views or because they're critical of critical race theory? And it's the ethics body, like we've just seen in King's, where an ethics group at King's College has refused a research proposal on the basis that they didn't use the correct language in terms of, they say that they were misgendering and so on and so forth. They refused. That's the ethics committee. You'd have to go and complain about them within your own institution.
Yes.
Kathleen Stock in Sussex University was driven out by colleagues from her own institution with no support by the Vice-Chancellor.
Do you think, to look at it really in a broader way, do you think this really does, as many people that I know would say, this is the death knell, actually, of universities, this kind of thing, that in fact it's sort of finished? Particularly the humanities, although it's really creeping in everywhere, humanities particularly are prone to this kind of groupthink, orthodoxies that are permissible. But do you think that this really is, I think it's what Roger Scruton said, that the humanities are gone, the whole thing basically is gone?
No, I don't think that, but obviously you can bend the stick and indicate that's the trajectory. But one of the things that is fascinating is that there are sort of so many, as indeed Roger Scruton himself was, dissident academics who continue to do what they can to introduce new generations to the important aspects of knowledge that they need to, be familiar with in their different disciplines. So the problem is that as institutions, you're completely right. And yet within institutions, there are always people who fight back. So I've been gratified that we've had the rise of academics for academic freedom. They're springing up in universities. We know that the Free Speech Union has done a huge amount.
Yeah.
My own colleagues who run Living Freedom are putting on events around universities now that are introducing people to people like John Locke, some of the great thinkers, the foundational thinkers, saying, what can we learn from series? That's what Living Freedom does. And they've got a residential for 18 to 30-year-olds, largely students who go to that, to familiarise themselves with the philosophy, the history, and the politics of freedom, and to update it and to think how we can win these arguments. So I do think there is something of a fight back. It might be a minor one. I also know many academics who, even though they have to do it in a clandestine way, will be interested in, this interview, in some of the documentaries that you make, who'll be introducing their students to alternative ways of seeing things. So I think we have to see that there is a kind of guerrilla warfare, metaphorically, of course, going on campuses. One of the problems, of course, is for many students, they are not encouraged to be free thinkers. That's not the climate. They do see going to university in a rather contractual way. We've paid our money, we want to pass. What job are we going to get? So the pursuit of truth and pursuit of knowledge is an ideal that some, maybe a minority, go for, but which is quickly stamped out of them. And undoubtedly, a lot of them are almost not indoctrinated, it's too strong a word, but they're just assumed to have the correct opinions on a range of political issues that doesn't allow any debate or discussion, and that is incredibly dangerous in terms of echo chambers, not allowing a broader society to have discussions about important matters. And what we can all be worried about is that all of those students, and this is a huge number of members of the population, the ideal is that they want there to be 50%, it might be 30, 35, 40% of young people go to university. Where do they end up? In the civil service, running society, running the institutions. They go off and work in museums. And then we wonder why museums are cancelling their own collections. Well, the education that many of those people will have got will have told them that that's the correct way to behave without even a debate. And so what I'm more worried about is that they are reproducing the norms that we all end up fighting. And so it seems, I just don't want to give up on the ideal of the university. I want to keep fighting for those students who go there with a different endeavour in mind, that they really genuinely want to learn, to acquire knowledge, to create new ideas. And they might be a minority. I think they're probably a larger group than we hear from, because they're chilled out and silenced by cancel culture into not opening their mouths. That doesn't mean they're not there and they're not listening. So it's up to us grown-ups to give them something to listen to.
I think I would entirely agree with that. I've met such bright younger people, actually, but they do have independence of thought. They somehow have managed to slip through the net, and that includes universities. The thing that worries me, I suppose, a bit, Claire, really is that, and we know this from the NCF because we have our locals groups and people, is that the great sort of under-publicised area, of course, is ordinary people at work who basically now really are pretty confused about what they can and cannot say. There's a kind of air of confusion. And, they can get fired maybe. And that, I think, they seem to have very little power. Students do have vice chancellors, even if they're not, going for this bill. But the other people don't seem to have, and I don't think unions help them too much either. But one thing I wanted to just to move on to, actually, you recently chaired a meeting by the Bayes Business School, I think, which was about these sort of issues. It was about how difficult it is to be a contrarian. Now, you're also director of the Academy of Ideas, aren't you? And founder as well, founder of that. which was not exactly, is it right to say contrarian, but it was just like, well, I've spoken to myself, it's like a huge platform for all sorts of discussion. Do you think that that side of things, just simply in the public sphere, is actually under any kind of threat? I mean, do you sort of think twice when you're doing the battle of ideas, for example, every year? Do you think, shouldn't have that person or that? Do you ever?
Yeah. Well, I think that the notion of contrarianism is a slightly difficult one. I really admire Ali Mirage, who set up the Contrarian Prize, and I know what he was trying to do with it. I suppose I have a slight anxiety that there's something peculiar about if somebody says black, you say white. You know, that it feels a little bit like I might have been a contrarian at school, but it's something I wanted to grow out of. A lot of people, however, would describe myself as a contrarian. Probably they describe you in the same way, because what's happened is that what I would consider to be reasonably mainstream opinions stemming from the Enlightenment, stemming from, the great thinkers historically, have suddenly become seen as unpalatable minority cranky views. How did that happen? And so one is contrarian as much as I'm prepared to say that just because something's become an orthodoxy, I'm not going to go along with it. People might say that I'm just going against the grain, but actually it's because what has become an orthodoxy isn't challenged very much, and I think it's that we have an obligation to challenge if we disagree with something. I don't challenge things I agree with, but there's not very many people who are prepared to speak out. And this, the issue we were talking about of campus culture and cancel culture has spilled out of the universities, as you indicated just a moment ago, into workplaces, largely driven by HR departments, but a broad cultural shift has occurred, and there is a way that you feel completely that you don't know the language, am I going to say the wrong thing? I'm actually constantly feeling, and I'm kind of not exactly easy to cancel, but I feel as though I'm walking on eggshells. I'm not quite sure. Did that?
Yeah.
Am I pushing things? Because actually, it's very unpleasant to be demonized as as some kind of extreme far right extremist, or I kind of got used to the kind of gammon label around Brexit, but constantly being delegitimized in that way is unpleasant. Now, and I'm a baroness, right? If you're just like going to work every day, the last thing you want is for your colleagues to be talking about you as though you're some kind of a mad, awful, with terrible views. And some people shy away, I think. Now, one thing that has made me really reflect on this is we haven't just got a free speech issue here. We've got a new problem, which is compelled speech. Because you might think in an atmosphere like that, well, I might not say anything. Well, that's not allowed either. You're told you have to actively say, I support taking the knee. You have to actively say, I support transgender identity. You're not allowed to go, well, I'd rather not say, or, this is just at work, there you are.
Or pronouns, people will say.
And the good example is pronouns, because it's enforced, isn't it? Wear your pronouns on your lapel, use those pronouns. You suddenly see all these complete people you've known for a million years suddenly using their pronouns in their social media descriptions, and you think, in their LinkedIn especially, their professional, that they haven't chosen to do that. That's kind of compelled speech in order to get by. And so that's exactly one of the problems. There's a thing where there are people who are called race mentors, and race mentors' jobs, often in the civil service, and some of them now are diversity mentors, are to go around and encourage healthy conversations about race and diversity. What's a healthy conversation? Can you imagine being sidled up to by one of these people who says, I'm here to encourage you to talk healthily about... You'd be terrified. You'd be absolutely terrified that you say the wrong thing. But you'd have to say something. So what happens is people follow scripts in order not to fall foul of these terrible speech codes and so on. In other words, we're encouraging society to speak in bad faith. We're telling young people not to think out loud and say, I'm not sure, can I ask, but to actually follow a script, the correct script, will get you by, which effectively is an assault on what you described earlier as a free society. We can't say what we think, even if what we think then is something that can be challenged and you might change your mind. I mean, I've certainly changed my mind many times because I've said what I think. Somebody else has said, what a load of rubbish that is. We've had an argument and I thought, oh, what I thought wasn't any good. I'll reflect again.
Yeah.
But that you can't even move in that direction. You have to follow the given script. I find that really worrying. So on contrarianism, I can understand that contrarianism is something that people will shy away from because you don't want to lose your job. You can literally lose your job. But if we effectively marginalise dissent, scepticism and contrarianism, the minority view, the awkward squad who ask difficult questions, we will never, ever, ever move forward as a society. We'll get stuck. It's the death of intellectual life.
Well, aren't we in that state?
We are. We are, but we're not yet jailed for it. I mean, for me, this is a reflection of, you'll know that historically, I'm from a left-wing background. I was the publisher of LM, Living Marxism. And I was a Trotskyist, so I never liked the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. But I just wanted to make that point because I am not unaware of the fact that what we are living through now feels to me to resemble what it must have been like to live in Eastern Europe under Stalinism.
That's why they're so hot on. This is one of the reasons given why some of the Eastern European and Central European countries are very hot on these issues, because they know what it's like.
Exactly. So you feel all the time, I never thought that I would live in a situation where you would not be able to speak out loud in case your neighbour reported you, whereas we live in a society that's actively encouraging the neighbour to report on you. And that actually if the neighbour doesn't report on you, then they are done for guilt by association. I mean, effectively, that's what we're saying when we have these equality, diversity and inclusion officers going around like workplaces checking on what people think and what they say. I mean, it's remarkable. And so in that sense, it's almost becoming an obligation to be a contrarian or a dissenter if you're in a position that you can. I mean, I'm always wary of saying, I always worry. I do actually do a lot of talks in, sixth form and schools and universities. There's usually a few walkouts, but there are some teachers and lecturers who insist actually in a good way of allowing different views to be heard and students wanting that. When I do that, I'm slightly aware of the position I'm in, which is I want to call them to be courageous, but I don't want to expose them.
Yes,
they're young people at the start, and I know how vicious it is. So actually, I'm much more interested now in talking to the academics and saying, come on, you've got to form a form of solidarity with the students. And that's what we've done with this Living Freedom series, actually, which is it's academics working with students. So it's not either or, putting on events for students, but both together.
What is it? How does it, excuse me, Claire, how does it actually work, this Living Freedom?
Yeah, so it's just a series of lectures. They've just started being rolled out. They've done some in Cambridge, they've got some coming up in Oxford, going to Durham, and going to various universities where it's kind of aimed at first years, What can you learn from, as I said, what can you learn from Locke, but what can you learn from Simone de Beauvoir, what can you learn from any number of the classic thinkers, where you get two people in to give the lecture and then a group of students are able to ask. But it's an update, it's not just a historical, it's what can we learn from?
Yes.
And they've proved to be a great success because in a way you can have these discussions, and what the academics, people like Arif Ahmed, worked with us on the Cambridge events, what we're trying to do is to encourage students that he said just haven't got familiarity with the history of ideas, but also haven't got the confidence necessarily to associate themselves. And you don't want to just be, because this is what I was going to say about some understandable reactions to this climate of conformity, is to be outrageous. I mean, especially, so some free speech societies say, we're not having this cancel culture, so we're going to invite Tommy Robinson onto camp. It's almost like to be provocative, and that can be a bit irritating because that's a bit contrarian for the sake of it, rather than actually trying to create discussion and debate and a space in which people can, not a safe space, but a space in which actually you can have these intellectual arguments out. And I think that's why, as I say, contrarianism is something which is an important concept, but it shouldn't be treated immaturely. And I don't like myself that kind of like, we're going to go for the shocking. But, you know, I understand young people, they're going to do that kind of thing.
I suppose the reason that people maybe want to shock, you see this in the arts in a way. Well, actually, you don't see it anymore in the arts. That's the last place you see it. Is that it doesn't really matter, it seems, whether it's of a high quality, when you're talking about freedom, or the high quality, i.e. Salman Rushdie, or whether it's of a very low, what you might call, or what would have been characterized as, say, like Charlie Hebdo, a cartoon. People say, oh, well, you know, deliberately put on. No. These things are always going to now.
Well, exactly. You're spot on there, because the truth is, the original part of this conversation was about me being cancelled from Royal Holloway for giving a talk entitled "The Importance of Debate." I mean, I might as well have gone in saying I'm going to show that Charlie Hebdo magazine, wouldn't I? I mean, you know, if you can get cancelled for something as anodyne as that, then you can see what happens. It's also the case that there is a danger, and we've seen this in the reaction to Posey Parker in New Zealand, which is she's basically, because Posey Parker has got a very uncompromising style, absolutely won't compromise. You know, she's got a very direct way of explaining her views on sex versus gender, very upfront, no messing, no, you know, mealy-mouthed approach there. Not necessarily the way I deal with it. But because of that, people are saying she deserved what she got.
Yes.
And we've seen this actually, because this has been particularly galling in relation to things like the issue of the Batley Grammar School teacher, which is, well, if you go around showing provocative images of Mohammed, what can you expect to happen? It's like, well, what you can expect to happen is that as an RE teacher, you're allowed to carry on without a mob outside the school that then threatens you with violence and you have to go into hiding. But therefore, you're absolutely right that I can understand that it doesn't matter whether it's provocative or not. I'm simply saying that I want to rehabilitate or the notions of free speech as being an important value. And I just don't want to overdo it in terms of a caricature of it. That's the point I was trying to make. You just finally, you asked me about how we get on with the battle of ideas. So we try not to be, we don't try and be unduly provocative. We try and have discussions around, you know, if you have 100 panel debates on everything that from science, you know, ethics, morality, religion, politics, and all the rest of it, you're going to cover a lot of subjects. But it doesn't matter how well thought through they are. We produce those very carefully. We think about who we're inviting. We try and invite a wide range across the political spectrum. That we found that it doesn't make any difference anyway, because even something as straightforward as our slogan, free speech allowed, is considered to be an extremist position. Our very well thought through, curated panel discussions are accused of being, you know, full of hate mongers trying to stir up the culture wars. I mean, you think, for goodness sake. So that, of course, doesn't encourage people to be nuanced. But I think we do have to stick to our intellectual guns on this one. I mean, I know how to do black and white headline, you know, clickbait. I have no problem with other people doing it, but I'm not doing it. I'm very clear, and I think that some of the work that you've done here at the New Culture Forum has been very important. You know, who needs your documentaries, some would say. You know, just have a headline. You know what I mean? All you have to do is go, I'm anti-woke and you're woke. But actually, you know that you have a role that's more educative in a way. You know, you want to do in-depth interviews, but also in-depth investigations. And I think that that's what society needs. I think that's what we owe that generation, because they need to actually have access to some very good quality, challenging material.
Well, yes, and also going right back to how we started talking about younger people who seem not to care about free speech, my reasoning is quite simply that quite often they don't know what they're meant to be defending. They don't know what is so special about it, and they don't, for that matter, know what is so special about the society that maybe has produced it.
Exactly.
And so they've got to know somehow, or I hope they do. That's one of the reasons for that. Before we close, just actually very topical this week, I think that something that really concerned me was looking at a clip you might have seen on Twitter of Richard Dawkins speaking to Piers Morgan. And it's the first time I think I've seen that on this free speech issue. He just wouldn't answer. He wouldn't answer various questions. I think they were about Shimei Begin and Salman Rushdie. And you might put that down to the particular topic of Islam. But the fact is, he was not going to put himself in that position. And I sort of, I'm not condemning him for that. To me, that is an absolute product of people not speaking up for free speech in the way that they should.
I was shocked by that clip. I think what it shows you, and I've noticed this myself, which is that many people will come up to me in relation to the gender issue and say, well done, I agreed with you, absolutely. But they're whispering it.
Yes, exactly.
They're looking around. Now, by the way, these are eminent senior members of the House of Lords, right? So they're not exactly in a position where they're frightened for their jobs. I mean, it's been very gratifying that so many members of staff, by the way, people who work in the House of Lords have also gone up and said, Ricky Gervais, love what you do. That's been nice. But senior political figures avoid certain topics, gender being one of them. What I thought was fascinating about that Professor Dawkins point was that he's actually got himself into trouble over the gender issue and been quite firm on it. But he wasn't touching the issue around radical Islam. It was almost as though he was frightened. And maybe it's that you think, God, I'm already under cosh on one thing, I'm not going to go there on another. But when you see senior figures, in public life, frightened to speak out, then I think we do live in a fairly, there's a sort of tyranny there. And we watched him do that. Most of the time we don't witness somebody going, I'm not speaking. But what I've noticed is that in the House of Lords is they're just absent from the room when the controversial issues are discussed.
Absolutely.
They're conveniently got something else on. Or we've noticed it when we organised the Battle of Ideas Festival, when particularly people on, left-leaning, liberals, more mainstream, many mainstream commentators who've, spoken at the Battle of Ideas over the years, say maybe not now. Because also the other thing that's happened is they try and, one of the tactics used against those of us who are arguing these kind of more difficult positions are dealt with as a kind of guilt by association. So you'll get somebody who'll say, look, I know I've spoken at the Battle of Ideas before, but my mates are sort of saying that you're associating with far-right conspiracy mongers on this, that and the other. So, but a couple of them admit it, others just say, oh, sorry, can't make it this year. But when you start seeing a pattern, so I think what we're seeing is a chilling effect. It's very difficult to make that numerically count for anything, but I think therefore in a funny sort of a way that interview was helpful but terrorizing, that somebody, he's the most outspoken, goodness knows, the idea that Richard Dawkins would go, I'm not going there because it might offend someone. You think, you are kidding me, right? You say the most offensive things, lots of things that I disagree with that I find offensive.
I don't think
he was actually like, no, I don't.
Yes, he didn't even start. He didn't get mealy-mouthed.
No, he just, I don't. No, but I'm saying we witnessed somebody doing what we know happens daily.
I think that's a perfect example, though. There, I don't name him actually. I think it's a perfect.
I know.
Perfect example there, where all you needed was a reasonably senior politician to say, do you know, I've just seen this clip, or even tweet it and say, I'm appalled at this, we believe in free speech, just to back the man up.
I understand. And it's also the case, by the way, that cancel culture makes cowards of us all. And I don't want to imply in any way that I don't understand it. And you are right to ask me, and I've tried to say, I'm not so brave. You know, I try and speak out, but of course, sometimes I get a knot in my stomach and think, oh no, I don't want to speak on this way. I know what will happen. And so I'm suggesting that when people in positions of authority, who really are quite hard-nosed, thin, you know, not thick-skinned, when we're frightened, when we're kind of looking over our shoulder, can you imagine what it feels like to be a young teacher, a young plumber, a young student, everyone, people who are starting off in life, trying to make their way, if they know they're going to be treated as though they're like Nazi scum, you're going to be terrified. And if you then see the people who've got authority, got some power backing off, then we know we've got real problems on our hands.
Well, Claire, look, thank you very much for talking to us about that. We have exclusive members, you know, who watch, and you know, we usually give them one question just for them, if you just hang around for a minute. But in the meantime, thank you very, very much. It was Baroness Fox, Claire Fox. Thank you. We shall see you next week. Thanks, bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.